The early morning sun spilled its timid gold across the rolling hills of the neglected estate, setting the dukest grass aglow as if each blade had been dipped in molten light. Mist lingered in the hollows, curling and whispering like timid spirits along the edges of the overgrown orchard. There, amidst the ruins of her late father's house, a young woman labored alone, her hands calloused, her dress smudged with the soil and dust of a property abandoned to time. She lifted a broken board, inspecting its warped edges, then set it carefully into place, balancing both hope and desperation in equal measure. The wood was splintered, the nails rusty and bent, yet she would not be deterred. Her eyes, a clear and unyielding blue, mirrored a steadfastness that seemed to defy the world's judgment. From the small village at the foot of the estate, murmurs had already begun to circulate. Old wives leaned on crooked gates, peering through gaps in the hedgerows, whispering of folly and imprudence. "She dares to rebuild what is lost with nothing but scraps," one muttered, a hand trembling with both curiosity and judgment. Another scoffed, "A fine match for a man of rank she will never find." The words carried on the morning air, drifting over the hills with a sharpness that grazed the young woman's back. Though she neither turned nor faltered, she had learned to endure the sting of gossip, to shoulder it as one might carry a heavy beam. Still, the weight pressed upon her, mingling with the ache in her arms and the soreness in her knees. Every hammer strike, every careful alignment of splintered wood, was an act of defiance, a quiet proclamation that she would not yield to the cruel inclinations of the world. The estate, once vibrant with laughter and the clatter of servant steps, now bore the melancholy of neglect. Its stone walls were mottled with ivy and the occasional daub of moss. The windows, dark and unwelcoming, reflected only the pale morning light and the girl's determined silhouette. She paused to rest, wiping her brow with the hem of her sleeve, and allowed herself a brief survey of the land that had been her father's pride. Memories pressed gently upon her, her father's voice, deep and certain, directing workers and organizing the estate with a meticulous hand. Her mother's quiet laughter, now absent, echoing only faintly in the corners of her mind. The silence that had settled over the ruins seemed almost oppressive, yet it also carried a sort of clarity. Here, in the midst of desolation, she was free to shape something new, however humble its beginnings might be. Her movements were deliberate, yet graceful, each shift of body and tilt of head betraying an innate elegance that belied her station. She knelt to measure a particularly crooked plank, her fingers tracing the uneven surface, and a sigh escaped her lips, a mixture of fatigue, hope, and the faintest undercurrent of longing. Her breath rose in small clouds, merging with the morning mist, and for a moment she felt utterly alone, a solitary figure against a vast and indifferent landscape. And yet, in that solitude, there was also strength, a quiet heroism born of necessity. Every stroke of the hammer, every careful adjustment of the wood, was more than construction. It was survival, determination, and the assertion of dignity in a world eager to strip her of it. From the forest's edge, a horse's hoof struck the earth, soft and distant at first, yet unmistakably deliberate. The sound drew her gaze upward, and she glimpsed a figure standing beneath the branches, partially obscured by the filtered light. He was tall, of commanding presence, yet there was a gentleness in the way he observed her, an admiration that seemed to ripple across the air between them. His attire marked him unmistakably as a man of rank, a tailored coat, polished boots, and a sword at his side, yet his eyes held a warmth that softened the rigid formality of his stance. For a moment, they simply regarded one another, the world falling silent save for the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the village stirring awake. The Duke's gaze lingered on her hands, calloused yet deft, noting how she moved with purpose and care, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of courage, of resilience, of a spirit that dared to defy expectation. The villagers' gossip had reached his ears, carried on the breeze, and through fleeting glances from travelers on the road. They spoke of folly, of unworthiness, of impropriety, yet he saw none of these faults in the woman before him. She was, in his eyes, a study in fortitude, a beacon of authenticity in a landscape increasingly dominated by appearances and rigid social expectations. He admired her not for beauty alone, though it was undeniable, but for the integrity etched into every line of her posture, every precise strike of hammer upon board. His chestnut horse shifted beneath him, restless, as if sensing the tension and anticipation that coiled in the air, and he found himself wishing he could step forward, speak words of encouragement, offer aid. Yet restraint held him at bay. The proper observances of society dictated distance, yet his heart longed to bridge it. She, unaware of his presence in detail, felt only the sensation of being observed, a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure on her consciousness that both unnerved and intrigued her. A glance to the treeline brought sight of the Duke's figure, distant yet undeniably present, and her pulse quickened. There was no malice in his eyes, only interest, and perhaps something gentler, admiration tempered with reserve. She wondered who he might be, what station he held, and why he would linger so, silent and watchful. The uncertainty sparked a flutter of curiosity, a yearning that mingled uneasily with the fatigue and ache that had weighed upon her all morning. She resumed her work, hammering the planks into place with renewed focus, yet the memory of his gaze lingered, a quiet ember in her mind. The sound of the hammer rang sharper, more resonant, as if in response to an invisible accompaniment, and she realized that the loneliness she had carried like a garment was no longer absolute. There was now a presence, distant but undeniable, that had begun to weave itself into the fabric of her mourning. Her determination, already steadfast, seemed somehow emboldened, as if the mere knowledge of being seen lent courage to her hands and shoulders. By the time the sun had climbed higher, the first crude outline of the shelter had taken shape. Boards, mismatched and jagged, formed the beginnings of a roof and walls, imperfect yet serviceable. The young woman stepped back, hands on her hips, surveying her morning's labor. Pride mingled with exhaustion, and she allowed herself a small, private smile, a rare acknowledgment of accomplishment amid adversity. And in that moment, a rustle of leaves and the faintest creak of leather caught her attention. She turned, and though he remained at the forest's edge, the Duke's eyes met hers directly, unwavering and intent. It was in that shared glance, fleeting yet charged, that the morning's work found its true measure, not in the splintered wood or the labor of her arms, but in the acknowledgment of her spirit by another. The world's gossip and judgment had not been silenced, but a new presence had entered the narrative, subtle yet profound, and it was enough to stir the promise of something yet unseen. She did not yet know his intentions, and he did not yet cross the boundaries set by decorum, yet in the quiet space between them, a story began to form, a story of courage, of recognition, and of the possibility that even amidst ruin, love might find its delicate first roots. And as the Duke lingered, his gaze fixed upon her with a quiet admiration, the young woman felt a stirring of hope, tentative yet undeniable, that perhaps the world, with all its weight and scrutiny, might not be so unforgiving after all. The next morning dawned with a delicate, misty light that filtered through the tall oaks bordering the estate, painting the dew-laden grass in soft silver and green. The young woman returned to her labor, her determination unshaken, yet there was a subtle lightness in her step, a faint curiosity in her gaze. Overnight, someone had left a small bundle of lumber at the edge of her clearing, boards of fine oak, neatly cut and stacked, their surfaces smooth and unmarred by time. No note accompanied them, only the quiet suggestion of kindness. She approached cautiously, suspicion and hope warring within her. Could someone truly care for her toil, or was this a jest of the village, a quiet mockery disguised as generosity? Yet as her hands brushed the polished wood, warmth spread through her chest, a tentative comfort that seemed almost too delicate to trust. Her mind traced the possibilities, scanning the nearby hedgerows and the edge of the forest, half expecting to glimpse some hidden observer, a mischievous eye peering through leaves. And yet no one appeared. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying only the faint song of a morning bird, and the bundle seemed to exist in splendid isolation, a silent offering without witnesses or claimants. She selected the boards carefully, aligning them with the splintered framework of her shelter. With each placement, her spirits lifted. The rough angles now promised sturdiness. The roof could finally hold. The walls might keep out rain. Every hammer strike rang with a newfound confidence. echoing like a pulse in the quiet morning. Meanwhile, the Duke watched from beyond the treeline, concealed yet enthralled. He had sent the lumber, taking the precaution that only one of his rank would instinctively consider, maintaining distance, preserving dignity, yet granting aid. He leaned against a gnarled oak, fingers tracing the leather of his gloves, heart fluttering at the sight of her engrossed in work. She did not yet know his identity, and the notion pleased him. Admiration untainted by expectation, affection unspoken and private, a connection forged in simplicity rather than ceremony. He marveled at her resilience, the curve of her shoulders as she lifted the boards, the careful deliberation with which she hammered them into place. She worked not for attention or reward, but for necessity, and in this truth he found a kind of beauty no gown or jewel could bestow. Hours passed with the sun climbing steadily, golden warmth gilding the edges of the trees, highlighting the young woman's diligent movements. Sweat dampened her hair, clinging strands framing her determined face, yet she moved with a rhythm born of focus and necessity. Occasionally, her hands faltered, nails splitting against the rough boards, a shiver of fatigue coursing through her arms. Each stumble was met with a breath drawn deep, a pause, and then resumed effort. The Duke's heart tightened at each small hardship. He longed to ride forward, to offer his own hands in aid, yet propriety restrained him. To approach uninvited would scandalize the villagers and compromise her dignity, a transgression he could not risk. Instead, he sent encouragement through subtle gestures, a carefully placed plank, a borrowed hammer left beside her, each token a silent whisper of attention. Curiosity began to sparkle in the young woman's eyes, mingling with gratitude. Who would know of her plight, and yet see the labor and care she poured into it? Who would understand that her persistence was not mere obstinacy, but the very inheritance of her father's spirit, a legacy of fortitude she could not abandon? She began to anticipate these small, anonymous gifts, each new delivery carrying the quiet thrill of possibility. Each piece of smooth wood became more than material. It was a symbol of unseen support, a reassurance that she was not entirely alone in her endeavor. The walls of her shelter grew higher, the roof more secure, and with each improvement, a subtle confidence took root in her chest, mingling with the lingering uncertainty. By midday, the wind had shifted, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and the faint musk of the forest floor. The Duke, emboldened by the morning's observations, finally urged his horse forward. The chestnut's hooves pressed into the soft earth with a rhythmic certainty, and with every stride he drew nearer, attention coiling tighter within him. He approached slowly, deliberately, aware that his sudden presence might frighten or startle her, yet compelled by a force he could neither name nor resist. The young woman looked up from a particularly stubborn board, hammer poised in midair, and their eyes met for the first time with full recognition. She froze, a mixture of surprise, apprehension, and fascination holding her in place. He dismounted smoothly, boots pressing into the earth, a gentleman's careful courtesy evident even in the smallest gesture. "Good day, miss," he said, his voice low, steady, yet carrying a warmth that brushed against the quiet ache of her morning. "I could not help but notice your diligence. You labor with admirable fortitude." His words were formal, measured, yet threaded with something unspoken, a recognition of her struggle that no ordinary compliment could capture. She inclined her head, uncertainty and curiosity flickering across her face. "I thank you," she murmured, voice soft, laced with reserve. "I do what I must. It is my duty and my inheritance." Her hands, smudged with soil and splintered wood, rested lightly on her hips, a subtle assertion of independence. He moved closer, careful to maintain respect, and gestured toward the newly delivered boards. "I thought these might ease your work," he said, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "You should not be burdened unnecessarily. One's labor deserves both acknowledgement and aid when it can be given." She glanced at the lumber, eyes widening as realization dawned. "These you brought them?" she asked, a tremor of wonder threading her tone. He inclined his head, a faint smile softening the stern lines of his face. "I did. The work of such dedication should not go unnoticed, and I wished to assist where I could." Their hands brushed as she lifted a board into place, the contact fleeting yet electric, sending a warmth through both that neither could entirely name. The afternoon light bathed them in a gentle glow, the distant hum of the village fading into insignificance, leaving only the sound of hammer on wood and the quiet rhythm of shared purpose. Each glance, each careful movement, carried weight beyond practicality. Each word and gesture hinted at something deeper, something tender yet restrained. For the first time, the young woman felt a sense of companionship, fragile but undeniable, threading its way through the monotony of her labor. Yet even in this growing intimacy, the shadow of scrutiny lingered. The villagers would notice, they always did, and gossip would ripple through the valley. She could not yet trust the softness of this moment fully, nor the gentleman whose hands had guided boards alongside hers. The Duke, too, felt the tension of social expectation pressing against his desire, the invisible chains of propriety reminding him that admiration alone must suffice for now. But in the quiet intimacy of shared labor, the world's harsh judgment seemed to fade, leaving a slender corridor where courage, trust, and the faintest glimmer of affection could take root. As the sun began its descent, casting long amber shadows across the clearing, the shelter stood taller, its walls straightened by unseen hands and careful attention. The young woman stepped back, surveying her work, cheeks flushed with exertion, and something warmer, subtler, a stirring of hope, tentative yet real. The Duke remained at the edge, silent, observing with a careful balance of respect and longing. Their eyes met again, a quiet understanding passing between them, that recognition, even unspoken, could be a bridge over distance, and that the morning had brought more than mere timber to the clearing. And as the first sigh of evening wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of approaching dusk, the young woman dared a thought that had seemed impossible mere days ago, that perhaps, just perhaps, aid could arrive in forms both tangible and unseen, and that the world might contain moments where courage, dignity, and quiet admiration converged in ways that could alter the course of a life. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, honeyed shadows across the clearing, gilding the rough boards of the shelter with a tender, almost sacred light. The young woman stepped back from her labor, wiping the sweat from her brow with the sleeve of her dress, and for a moment allowed herself to simply breathe, to feel the satisfaction of work completed and the quiet triumph of perseverance. The shelter, though simple and uneven in places, stood solid, its crooked walls holding against the wind and the weight of countless hours of effort. She ran a hand along the edge of the roof, feeling the smoothness of the oak boards the Duke had sent, their presence a silent testament to kindness, thoughtfulness, and something that stirred a warmth in her chest she had not yet named. The Duke, still at the edge of the clearing, regarded her with a quiet intensity that seemed to draw the light around him into sharper focus. He had dismounted fully now, boots pressing into the soft earth, hands resting lightly on the saddle of his horse, though his attention belonged entirely to her. His chestnut mount shifted, sensing the change in the air, and he remained still, knowing that any sudden movement might disturb the delicate balance of this moment. His gaze followed her every gesture, not in judgment, but in admiration, a reverence born of recognition. He had watched her for days now, unseen yet attentive, marveling at her resolve, the elegance in her endurance, and the dignity she carried despite the gossip that swirled like a persistent wind around the estate. She noticed him then fully, as if the last veil of distance had lifted. Her heart fluttered, a strange combination of surprise, hesitation, and curiosity tightening in her chest. He had been present in subtle ways already, the delivered lumber, the careful placement of tools, but now he stood there, tangible, undeniable, and she could no longer dismiss him as a fleeting observer of her toil. You have been helping me?" she asked, voice soft, almost trembling with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. His lips curved into the faintest smile, eyes catching the light in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I have," he replied, formal yet sincere. "I could not allow such work to go unsupported, nor did I wish you to bear these burdens alone. Your strength deserves acknowledgment, and your courage admiration." She lowered her gaze, the warmth of his words penetrating the armor she had wrapped around her spirit. For so long, She had relied only on herself, wary of others' intentions, mindful of the gossip that would twist any kindness into scandal. Yet in this moment, the caution began to soften, replaced by a hesitant trust, fragile but insistent. She raised her eyes to him again, searching for pretense, and finding none. The Duke's countenance was composed, dignified, yet touched by a quiet emotion she could not name, something that made the air between them feel both intimate and vast, as if the clearing itself had expanded to hold them alone in a suspended reality of light, sound, and unspoken possibility. He stepped closer, though not too close, respecting the boundaries dictated by propriety. Each movement was deliberate, careful, as if the simple act of walking a few paces toward her carried immense significance. "I have observed your perseverance," he said softly, voice threaded with a warmth that belied his formality. "And it has moved me, not merely for the labor you have undertaken, but for the dignity with which you carry yourself amid the harsh judgments of others." She drew a slow breath, the words settling over her like sunlight through leaves, and felt a weight she had carried for weeks begin to lift. I do what I must," she whispered, "but it is rare that anyone sees it so." For a heartbeat, silence reigned, punctuated only by the gentle rustle of the trees and the distant song of a lark. Then, as if drawn by some invisible current, he extended a hand, not in command, nor in expectation, but an invitation, an offering of both respect and trust. She hesitated, the impulse to retreat warring with the instinct to accept, to step beyond the protective walls she had built around her heart. And yet, something in his eyes, steady and unwavering, compelled her forward. Their fingers brushed lightly, a touch brief and electric, and a shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the cool afternoon air. He spoke then, with a voice both firm and tender. "I do not offer idle words. I offer my hand, my honor, and, if you will allow it, my heart. I wish to protect you, to cherish you, and to stand by you in all the days to come." Her chest swelled, a mixture of relief, astonishment, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of hope. She had never imagined that such a declaration could exist outside the pages of stories whispered in candlelight, or the dreams she had allowed herself only in solitude. And yet, here it was, real, tangible, offered with dignity and respect, carrying no threat to her independence, no hint of coercion, only an earnest desire to stand beside her, to honor both her labor and her spirit. The young woman's lips parted, a smile delicate and restrained, her eyes shimmering with emotion she scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge. I cannot find words," she murmured, voice thick with the swell of gratitude and disbelief. "What you offer, it is more than I dare hope for." He lowered himself onto one knee instinctively, though she had not requested it, the gesture formal yet suffused with genuine reverence. "Then allow these words to suffice," he said, "and the promise they carry. If you will permit me, we may face the world together, not as master and servant, not as noble and commoner alone, but as two who recognize the value of courage, respect, and devotion." The wind stirred, lifting loose strands of her hair, and for a moment the world seemed suspended, the clearing bathed in a golden haze of sunlight and promise. The shelter behind her, once a symbol of solitude and laborious struggle, now became a silent witness to an emerging bond, its crooked boards holding firm as though even the rough would acknowledge the significance of this encounter. The village, the gossip, the relentless judgment, all of it faded to insignificance, eclipsed by the quiet gravity of connection, recognition, and mutual respect. She placed her hand gently in his, their fingers intertwining, a gesture that carried volumes more than words ever could. He rose slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on hers, and for the first time, she allowed herself to see the man not merely as a distant observer or benefactor, but as someone who could be a partner, a protector, and a companion in the truest sense. The afternoon light deepened, shadows stretching long across the clearing, and in that subtle twilight, the world seemed both vast and intimate, holding the promise of love, dignity, and shared endeavor. And yet, even in this unfolding moment of tenderness and mutual understanding, a faint sense of anticipation lingered, a whisper of uncertainty, not of their connection, but of the world beyond the clearing, waiting to witness, to challenge, or to affirm the bond forming in this quiet place. The young woman drew a slow, steadying breath, her gaze unwavering, and though the sun had begun its descent, the warmth of hope and the weight of possibility settled within her chest. She understood, in a profound and unspoken way, that this was merely the beginning of a story, one that would demand courage, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity and devotion now tenderly offered. As the Duke stepped closer, his hand still holding hers, he whispered, almost imperceptibly, "Whatever the world may say, whatever trials may come, know that this moment, our labor, our care, our hearts, stands apart, and I will honor it always." Her lips curved into a faint, resolute smile, and the soft brush of his thumb across her hand spoke louder than any words could. In the quiet that followed, the shelter, the clearing, and the gentle descent of sunlight seemed to hold their breath with them, a witness to the first true promise of shared courage, affection, and a future yet to be written. And in that suspended stillness, the young woman allowed herself a single, unguarded thought, fragile yet insistent, that perhaps, for the first time since her father's passing, she might believe that love, respect, and hope could coexist, and that the world, though vast and unpredictable, might bend gently to honor the strength of a determined heart.